Liebe Mitreisende, hallo und willkommen zurück. Das ist die 27. Lektion in unserer großen Reise durch die deutsche Sprache. Let's begin with der Witz that I left you with at the end of our previous lesson. Remember, it went like this. Was soll man machen, wenn man in der Wüste eine riesige Schlange sieht? Now, if you were to ask a native speaker of German this question, 99.9% of the time, the image that will come to the mind first is this. Sehen Sie, das ist eine riesige Schlange. And in this situation, well, the best answer would probably be sofort und schnell weglaufen. But, and herein lies the humor behind our joke, it turns out that the noun die Schlange also has a second meaning. And if the listener goes with this other meaning, then the image that will come to mind is this. And in this particular situation, the most rational response to the question, was soll man machen, wenn man in der Wüste eine riesige Schlange sieht, is sich hinten anstellen. The play on words here is with die Schlange, because it can mean either snake or line. Okay, I know that nothing spoils a good joke more than explaining it, but it's my favorite joke in German, okay? This is mein Lieblingswitz. And now you know it too. Also dann, now that we've completed our first tutorial on wie wird man deutschsprachiger Komiker, let's move on to our first grammar topic, which, it just so happens, has to do with another of my favorite things, namely, mein Lieblingsbuch. Mein Lieblingsbuch heißt Der Name der Rose und wurde im Jahr 1980 von Umberto Eco geschrieben. Es gibt auch eine Verfilmung des Buchs. Now, maybe you're wondering, what does Professor Fremd's Lieblingsbuch have to do with German grammar? The answer? Alles. But more specifically, it's the book's title that gives us what we're looking for. So, let's take one more look at this title. Der Name der Rose. The gender of the noun Name is masculine. Der Name. Even though it ends in an E, and most German nouns that end in an E are feminine, der Name is an exception. It's actually a masculine noun. But check out the next noun in the title, Rose. Unlike der Name, Rose does follow the general rule of nouns ending in an E. Rose is a feminine noun, die Rose. But, as we can see in the title, the definite article here is der. Now, maybe you're thinking, oh, Rose is in the dative case. I mean, after all, the definite article for feminine dative nouns is der, as in, ich gebe der Katze den Thunfisch. However, the der in this title is not dative. It's not expressing an indirect object. Instead, it's expressing possession. And in German, the case that we use to express possession is called der Genitiv. Jawohl, meine Damen und Herren, the genitive is the fourth and final grammatical case in the German language. I promise. Whereas the nominative expresses the subject, the accusative the direct object, and the dative the indirect object in a sentence, the genitive case expresses a relationship of possession between two or more nouns. In the title, Der Name der Rose, the der is expressing a relationship of possession between the noun der Name and die Rose. In other words, the name of the rose. In fact, I used another example of the genitive in my earlier remarks about der Name der Rose. I said, es gibt auch eine Verfilmung des Buchs. The noun Buch is neuter, das Buch. But here it's in the genitive, and so its definite article becomes des. But that's not all. Notice that the noun Buch also has an S on it. This is also part of the genitive case in German. You see, if a noun is masculine or neuter, we also have to inflect the noun itself by adding an S. des Buchs. In a nutshell, this is how the genitive case works. You inflect the der or ein word in accordance with the noun's number and gender. And if the noun is masculine or neuter, you add an s or an es to the noun itself. For example, wo ist der Wagen deines Bruders? Wie heißt der Freund deiner Schwester? Wie ist die Adresse des Rathauses? And finally, wer ist der Autor dieser Bücher? Note, by the way, that if the masculine or neuter noun ends in an s or a z, we need to add an es. For instance, consider the nouns das Geschäft, der Film, der Fuchs, and das Gesetz. The first two get an s in the genitive, die Adresse des Geschäfts, and am Ende des Films. The second two, though, get an es, die Intelligenz eines Fuchses, im Namen des Gesetzes. Alles klar? Let's take a look at these endings with another of our handy tables. As you know, we've already covered the articles for nouns in the nominative, accusative, and dative cases. Now, however, we can officially consider this table complete. Since the genitive is the fourth and final case in German, it is also the final row. Sehr schön. And now, here's the part where I add one very important footnote about the genitive case in German. Aber keine Panik, it's a short footnote. And here it is. The genitive, you see, is seldom used in everyday spoken language. In other words, you really wouldn't walk up to your neighbor and ask, ist das der neue Wagen deiner Frau? Or, weißt du den Namen unseres Briefträgers? You see, the truth is, Germans just don't talk like this, at least not in their day-to-day conversations. Instead, they use a slightly different grammatical construction, one that actually resembles the possessive constructions in Romance languages, if you happen to know any of those, namely the von plus dativ construction. So, instead of asking their neighbor, ist das der neue Wagen deiner Frau? And weißt du den Namen unseres neuen Briefträgers? Germans will replace the genitive construction with a von plus dativ construction, like this. Ist das der neue Wagen von deiner Frau? Weißt du den Namen von unserem Briefträger? Alles klar? Now, perhaps you're wondering, well, when do native speakers of German use the genitive? Why do we have to learn it? Well, it's true that the genitive is rather scarce in the colloquial vernacular. But I can nevertheless assure you that it is still alive and ticking in more formal or stylized registers of spoken German, and it's especially still alive and ticking in written German. And so, to illustrate for you one particular language situation in which you're likely to hear the genitive in spoken German, I would like to invite into our studio a very, very special colleague from our newsroom. His name is Nils Ziegelstein, and he has some important world news events to report on. Guten Tag, meine Damen und Herren. Ich bin Nils Ziegelstein. Ich freue mich sehr, bei Ihnen im Studio zu sein. Es folgen jetzt die heutigen Nachrichten. Tintenfisch ins Gesicht. Als ein Tourist seine Kajaktour der neuseelischen Insel genoss, bekam er die Überraschung seines Lebens. Auf einmal tauchte aus dem Wasser neben ihm eine Robber mit einem Tintenfisch auf. Die Robber schleuderte den Tintenfisch gegen das Wasserfahrzeug und traf den Kapitän des Kajaks mitten ins Gesicht. Keine Wurst für Washington. Heute Nachmittag fand das erste offizielle Treffen zwischen der deutschen Bundeskanzlerin und dem amerikanischen Präsidenten statt. Während der Mahlzeit sprach die Kanzlerin über die Weltpolitik. Trumps Kommentare dazu waren, gibt es denn keine Wurst? Leider gab es keine Wurst auf dem Sondermenü. Der US-Präsident musste sich mit Fischsuppe norddeutscher Art begnügen. Meine Damen und Herren, das waren die heutigen Nachrichten. Ich bin Nils Ziegelstein, live aus dem Nachrichtenstudio. Ich danke Ihnen für das Zuschauen. Vielen Dank, Herr Ziegelstein. Wow, that's what I call important news, nicht wahr? At any rate, these reports are illustrative of how the genitive case really is used by news anchors and in other more formal registers of speech. What's more, in the second report, Keine Wurst for Washington, my colleague also uses two new examples of the genitive. Let's go over these now. Near the end of the report, Niels says this: Trumps Kommentare dazu waren, gibt es denn keine Wurst? The genitive construction we're after here is Trumps Kommentare. This is how you express possession with proper nouns. You add an S to the proper noun. For example, I might say, Professor Frims Hunde heißen Frieda und Diego. Mias Mann heißt Ralf. Or, Deutschlands Bevölkerung ist multikulturell. It's just like English, except that in written German, you do not add an apostrophe before the S. However, you do add an apostrophe in German if the proper noun ends in an S, a Z, or an X. But then you do not add an S. For example, Hans Auto ist neu. Fritz Bruder ist älter. Max Freunden kommt aus Zürich. The other new example of the genitive that Herr Ziegelstein uses in the story, Keine Wurst für Washington, occurs in the first word of the sentence, Während der Mahlzeit sprach die Kanzlerin über die Weltpolitik. This word, während, is a preposition, but it's not just any run-of-the-mill preposition, it is a genitive preposition. That's right, you heard me. I said Genitivpräposition. Recall that thus far in our journey, we've learned that there's a set of prepositions that always take 1, the accusative, durch, für, gegen, ohne, the dative, aus, außer, bei, mit, von, seit, nach, zu, if you recall, and 3, either the accusative or the dative, so-called two-way prepositions, and these are an, auf, in, hinter, neben, über, unter, vor und zwischen. Well, I am now happy to announce that there is also a set of prepositions that takes the genitive case. In fact, there are quite a few genitive prepositions, but nearly all of them are confined to the written language or to more formal spoken language. And some of them, like the prepositions wegen, trotz, and laut, are used with the genitive in written and formal language, but in colloquial, everyday speech, they're actually used in the dative. Here's what I mean. While you would write something like this in an email to a colleague, wegen des Wetters, trotz des Regens, or laut des Wetterberichts. In conversation with a friend, you would say, wegen dem Wetter, trotz dem Regen, laut dem Wetterbericht. This is actually a change in the language that's been going on for quite a while. But you know what? That's a topic for another great course. Learning German too, perhaps? Anyway, some of the more commonly used genitive prepositions include während, anstatt, wegen, innerhalb, and außerhalb. For example, you might read or write something like, statt eines Hundes wollten die Kinder eine Katze zu Weihnachten. Or, trotz seiner Versuche blieb Hans immer außerhalb unseres Freundeskreises. But remember, native speakers don't typically say things like this in everyday spoken exchanges. Alles klar? Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, let us now turn to our second grammar topic in this lesson, namely, Moment mal. You know what? Instead of just telling you about this new grammar, why don't I show you with an actual example? Alles klar? Gut. So then, I would like you to check out this super cute picture of a dog. Basically, there are two ways we could describe what's going on here. One way would be something to the effect of, Die Kinder waschen den Hund. This sentence is expressed in what linguists call the active voice. Now, the active voice is actually what we've been learning and using thus far in our journey. It's a perspective of describing states, actions, and events with a subject that's actively doing something. And we express this active action, so to speak, by conjugating the verb with the subject. In this picture, for example, the children are actively doing something to an object. The dog, that is. The children are washing the dog. In both English and German, the majority of everyday conversation is actually conducted in this, the active voice. Whether we say, ein Affe fährt den Wagen, or der Hund frisst eine Schildkröte, the poor turtle, what we're describing are actions that involve a subject actively doing something. And in both of these examples, and in our adorable dog washing example, we are describing a situation in which a subject is actively doing something to another object. However, there's also another way that we can describe our adorable dog washing scene. Namely, instead of using the active voice, Die Kinder waschen den Hund, we can also express the same thing in what's called the passive voice. As such, our sentence would go like this. Der Hund wird von den Kindern gewaschen. Did you see what I just did? I made the direct object in the active sentence into the subject in the passive sentence. Die Kinder are no longer the element in the sentence actively doing something. Instead, it's now der Hund that's doing something. It's the subject, but not in an active sense. Rather, it's getting something done to it. Namely, it's getting or being washed. Verstehen Sie? And this is actually the first step in forming the passive voice. Whatever person or thing serves as the object in an active sentence, you make that the subject in your passive sentence. For instance, take a look at the following sentence in the active voice. Mein jüngerer Bruder renoviert dieses Haus. Now, to rephrase this sentence in the passive voice, the object dieses Haus must become the subject. And with that, our first step is complete, but we still have just a few more steps to go before our active sentence truly becomes passive. In a nutshell, there are two essential components for building the passive in German. One, a helping verb, and two, a past participle. The helping verb, though, is always werden. But we also need to conjugate this helping verb for our subject. Here, dieses Haus is a third-person singular subject. And so we conjugate werden to wird. Next, we need to put our main verb, renovieren, into its past participle form, renoviert. And voila! We have a perfectly constructed passive sentence. Dieses Haus wird renoviert. And in fact, we could stop there without adding any information about by whom the house is getting renovated. The passive voice, you see, doesn't actually require this kind of information like the active voice does. Think about it. You can't construct a sentence in the active voice like this. Is renovating this house. Utterances like this are ungrammatical, right? The active voice requires a clearly stated subject. In the passive, however, you can leave out this information. In other words, you can say, this house is being renovated. Who's renovating the house? We don't know. All we know is that it's being renovated. And the same grammatical concept applies in German. We cannot say, renoviert dieses Haus. But we certainly can say, dieses Haus wird renoviert. You get it? Now, this does not mean that the passive voice doesn't allow us to express a clear doer of the action. That is, the by whom or by what. The passive does indeed allow this, albeit in a more roundabout way than in the active voice. Take our adorable dog being washed example. We could also describe the action here like this. Der Hund wird von den Kindern gewaschen. As you can see, when we want to specify the agent of the passive action, we do this with a prepositional phrase. Just like in English, in fact, which uses the preposition by. But in German, we use the dative preposition von. And so, to come back to our house being renovated example sentences, recall that the subject in the active sentence was mein jüngerer Bruder. Thus, if we want to make this noun the agent in our passive sentence, we first add a von, dieses Haus wird von, then we place the nouns in the dative case, together with the fitting endings on any adjectives. Dieses Haus wird von meinem jüngeren Bruder, and we complete the passive construction by placing the past participle at the end. Dieses Haus wird von meinem jüngeren Bruder renoviert. Alles klar? Nun, there is one exception to the use of von for expressing the agent in passive constructions. Here's what I mean. Take a look at this Hinweisschild. Tell me, what's the agent here? Genau, the agent is the noun video. This sign is warning us that this area is being monitored by video. But look at the preposition. It's not the dative preposition von. Rather, it's the accusative preposition durch. Here's another example, this time from a newspaper headline. Here, the agent is Brand. And again, the preposition is durch. What's going on in these examples is this. Because video and Brand are non-living things, and because their role in the event here is more of an instrument than as an initiator, we have to use the preposition durch. On the other hand, agents like die Kinder and mein Bruder obviously are living things, with a clear role as the initiators of the action. Therefore, we use the preposition von. Alles klar? Take the following sentence, which is similar to something you might find written in a novel. Die Dorfbewohner werden jede Nacht durch den heulenden Wind geweckt. Ooh, that's spooky. Here, der heulende Wind is the instrument of the villagers being woke up. Thus, we use durch. Now, compare it with this sentence. Die Dorfbewohner werden jede Nacht vom Bürgermeister geweckt. Now the source of being woke up is a human initiator, der Bürgermeister. Thus, we use the preposition von. Alles klar und wunderbar? Nun, meine Damen und Herren, as always, we've already covered a lot of material in this lesson. But before we exchange our customary Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich, there's just one more angle to the passive that I'd like us to explore. What if, instead of saying the dog is getting washed or the house is being renovated, what if we wanted to modify these passive constructions with a modal verb to express something like the dog has to be washed or the house should be renovated? Well, the German language also allows us to do this. Let me take you through a few examples of how we construct utterances like these in German. You'll see that it's really straightforward and that actually there's a clear pattern that we can apply across the board. This time, we'll start with this charming picture. Ach, meine Güte! Das sind schmutzige Hunde. I can only imagine what my wife would say if I brought my dogs home in this condition. Well, she'd probably say something in the neighborhood of this. Diese Hunde müssen sofort gewaschen werden. Notice that the modal verb here comes in the second position, as it usually does in main clauses. Also notice that at the end of the sentence, there's both a past participle and an infinitive form of the helping verb werden. Interesting, right? Let me give you one more example. Imagine that you're on an evening stroll through your neighborhood and you come across this scene. Mann, oh Mann, dieser Rasen ist furchtbar. And if you're anything like me, when you see a Rasen like this, you might say something to the effect of, Dieser Rasen soll heute gemäht werden. Again, the modal verb is in the second position, and at the end, there's a past participle followed by an infinitive form of werden. Here, then, is an illustration of how you construct passive sentences with a modal verb. If our subject is in sentence initial position, then our conjugated modal verb comes next, in the second position. In the third position comes any information about time, manner, agent, or place. And at the end of the sentence, we insert what's called a passive infinitive. A passive infinitive is a past participle plus the verb werden. For instance, gewaschen werden, gemäht werden. Und das, meine Damen und Herren, ist alles. That's really all there is to it. Thus, to come back one last time to our sample passive sentence about the house being renovated by my younger brother, well, let's spruce it up with a modal verb. Let's say the modal verb können. So the sentence would go, dieses Haus kann von meinem jüngeren Bruder renoviert werden. Also dann, meine Damen und Herren, that's all the time we have in this lesson. Leider. But stay tuned. Our discussion of the passive isn't quite complete. Not yet. And to show you what I mean, allow me to leave you with the following linguistic challenge. Are you ready? Using English as a comparison, how do you think we change a passive construction from the present to the past tense in German? For instance, in English we say, the dogs were washed, the dogs got washed, or the dogs have been washed. We change the helping verb to its simple past or present perfect form. Was or were, got, has or have been. So, using this comparative data from English, can you make an educated guess as to how this works auf Deutsch? In our next lesson, we'll find out just how accurate your educated guess is. Auf Wiedersehen und bis gleich.